In this video I want to discuss a little the issue of prostitution. It's something I've covered a little bit in other videos, but recently I came across an article in the Times which took an angle I hadn't seen before. An issue was raised that I hadn't considered before, and it's made me more convinced that criminalising prostitution would be a mistake, or criminalising clients would be a mistake, as is currently being proposed by a cross-party committee. That would follow the situation of Sweden and France. At the moment, those countries prosecute people who are, or at least criminalise people who are buying sex, but not those who are selling it, and they say in doing so they're protecting the more vulnerable party, which is the sex worker. Now, whilst their desire to protect the sex worker is to be commended, and it's certainly better than treating these women and sometimes men as criminals, I also think it's misguided and both morally and practically wrong to criminalise the clients. And basically David Aronovich in the Times, I don't have the article in front of me right now, but he made an interesting point about this. And what he said basically in this column was that there's some problems come about when you take the position that the client is a criminal only out to sort of take advantage of these women's bodies. For one thing, if you have a situation where those girls or women are being trafficked or being controlled by a violent pimp, then how is a crime against them meant to be brought to light? A lot of sex workers are reluctant to go to the police because they don't want their trade being interfered with, or they're concerned that their trade will be affected and they'll lose trade. And there is, I think it's fair to say, a trust breakdown between sex workers and the police, because frankly in many circumstances the police do treat sex workers as sluts, as not as women who have been forced into the situation in many cases. I'm not saying this is the case with all police forces, but I think it's just a fact that there is a trust breakdown in between sex workers and the police. Therefore, the sex workers themselves are very unlikely to go to the police if they, for example, have been raped or they have been a victim of violence. So who's likely to be a witness then to support their case? Another sex worker? Well, same argument there. The person most likely to be a witness is going to be the client, because most men who go to sex workers basically want sex. They don't go to rape the woman, they don't go to beat her up. I think that's a fair observation. Some do, but basically men pay for sex because they want sex, right? And that's common sense, right? That's what they go for. Most of them go there, pay the money and leave, and that's it. But you do have individuals who then get abusive and think that because it's only a sex worker they could do what they want. So obviously there is a real need to protect these women, especially if they've been trafficked. But I've heard of situations where men have went to a prostitute and they've suspected that she's underage or she's been trafficked, and their conscience has got the better of them and they've pulled out of it. But they won't report that to the police, because then they have committed an offence by going to her in the first place. So that's a problem that can be brought about, and David Aronovich, not in those exact words, but he touched on this issue. And that has been an issue that's been raised generally by those of us who don't believe that criminalising clients is the way forward. There's another issue which I believe has been hugely overlooked, and David Aronovich closed with this point. The simple fact is, in the real world, not everyone can easily love or be loved. What that means is it's incredibly naive and actually callous to, and that's my words by the way, to assume that everyone can just find the right partner, fall in love, and that's that. You get married and everyone's happy. In the real world, human relationships are complicated, and the fact is some people suffer years and years of involuntary celibacy or perpetual celibacy. Not because of religious reasons, not because they're bad people, but for one reason or another. Could be social awkwardness, it could be they're in a situation where they just don't get the opportunities. They're denied sexual intimacy. Now, I strongly believe that human intimacy is a human right, and it should be evaluated as a human right. But at the moment we're only hearing one side of this. Now, I think it's very important that the sex worker side is discussed, but to just vilify the clients, as is currently the case, it's stupid. And actually, he made a good point. He said, well, would you say to a dentist that they have a right to practice their trade and take out fillings, but the person visiting the dentist hasn't got a right to do that? It's all concerns the human body, right? So what he's basically saying is adults should be entirely sovereign of their own bodies. And I think that's a fair point to make. The moralists out there who say that they've no right to do that, I would say, what right do they have to judge those people? Yes, there's a lot of issues that need to be covered. For example, substance abuse, violent control of the sex trade, for example, by violent pimps, people trafficking. These are all grave issues. And he mentioned those issues. But I think part of the problem is this debate doesn't consider the position that a lot of clients are in. For example, David Aronovich quoted the fact that he's struck by the fact many sex workers say that some of their clients are disabled men. Okay? Now those are men who would obviously find social relations more difficult because of the barriers they face in life. So it's not as easy for a disabled person to get sexual intimacy as it is for others. So a man in that position, can anyone really blame him for looking at alternative ways? And I think it's callous for those who say that it should be banned, or that these men should be prosecuted, to not consider things like that. Now, of course, not every client is disabled, but it's just an example. There may be other situations. What about if you have a situation whereby someone's from an extremely religious family, and they might be gay, for example. In fact, this is something I've just thought of. And they're from a devout Muslim family, and they would possibly be killed if they were discovered. What if the only way that guy can get sexual intimacy is by going to a male prostitute? Now, it's common sense to show that to say that the lack of sexual intimacy is not healthy. It ultimately leads to sexual repression, which in turn leads to serious social anxiety, mental anguish, and ultimately all sorts of problems. Look at serial killers, look at the background they have. Very often sexual repression is a key factor. Now, I don't want this to be misinterpreted. I'm not saying that we should see sex workers as the solution for these problems and that they're commodities. Of course they're not. They're human beings as well, which is why it is important to see their perspective. But I've never come across any sex worker who says that it should be made illegal. And what they argue, what I've seen is the argument from sex workers is it should be decriminalised. But I've never seen a sex worker saying clients should be criminalised. Because they know if clients are criminalised, they then lose their trade and they become even more destitute. There should, of course, be methods for these people to deal with the issues like substance abuse, but it's naive to think all sex workers are in that trade for the same reason. They're as diverse as any group of people, actually. And I think it's just a mistake to criminalise clients. It's callous and it's counterproductive. Now, I'm not saying that all clients are people who are lonely and who just want love, sexual love. I know the word love is contentious there. Okay, intimacy. But and I'm well aware there are men out there who do see women's bodies as a commodity, right? I acknowledge that. and I've little sympathy for those sort of guys. But I do sympathise with men and women, in the case of male sex workers, who really have no other option. It's patronising, it's insulting, and it's callous to say to these people, oh well, the problem is in your own mind, it's your social problems, you just deal with it. No, that's not the real world. What I want to see is a situation whereby sex workers and clients work in a safe environment. What I mean by that is the sex worker doesn't fear violence and the client doesn't fear being arrested. And it would be a regulated situation whereby, whilst not perfect, at least when crimes do arise, if it's a legal situation, it's much easier for the sex worker to report that, because she would be reporting it in the same way that a shopkeeper would report, for example, being assaulted by a burglar. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but we have to recognise that the sex trade is a job, right? It's an income, and it's something that's been going on for thousands of years. Now, what this cross-party committee are proposing is not banning prostitution, but banning half of it, which is just stupid, because it's sex workers are definitely not going to support this proposal. It's not going to help them, because it's going to lose them trade, which then means their situation is even more destitute. You know, a lot of these women and men may be substance abusers, so it's not easy for them to get a regular job. There's many complex issues involved. It just seems to me that so long as the problem does exist, we should at least create a safer environment, at least regulate it, at least have a situation whereby, for example, underage girls or women who are being controlled by a violent pimp, they are given better safeguards. It's never ever ever going to be perfect, but I think this approach of punishing clients is misguided, targeting clients. Legislation should be targeting violent pimps. It should be targeting people traffickers. It should be targeting those clients who may well be violent or rapists. But punishing all clients is only going to, and just for the record, I haven't visited a sex worker, just in case you're wondering if I'm saying this from a personal perspective. I haven't, precisely because it is illegal to do that. And I've no desire to. It's not, that's just to clarify, right? That's not where I'm coming from in this. It's not from personal experiences, as an observation. But I do think part of the problem with this so-called debate is that only one side is being looked at. At the moment, the attitude to clients is basically, oh, they're just sleazy men who see women's bodies as commodities and that's it. So long as there's such a narrow outlook to the problem, then how can it be addressed? I feel quite strongly about that, because it's I just think it's going to backfire. And by the way, the Swedish model has not been a complete success. It did lower the rate of street crawling, I think the term is, initially, but then overall it just went back to the levels it was before. So it hasn't worked in Sweden. I'm not sure about the situation in France, but again, it's based on the premise of the client has the upper hand. Actually, that's another thing I want to question. Is that really the case? There's no fixed rate charges for how much a sex worker charges. So there is cases whereby, basically, it sounds almost shallow to say it, but there can be situations where a man can be basically robbed of his money. A situation, for example, whereby he's paid for sex and her violent pimps threaten him for more money. That's extortion, and of course he can't report that. It's the same situation. So really, is the idea that clients are in a very powerful position is just rubbish. Often these are desperate, lonely men who are doing it as a last resort. That doesn't sound like someone in power to me. And at the moment, there's absolutely no resources whatsoever in society to help people who are struggling with perpetual celibacy. People can laugh, but this is a very real issue. It causes severe mental health problems, and ultimately it can lead to suicide. So it's really not a trivial issue. And I believe it's very widespread. I mentioned men, but I believe a lot of women suffer from it as well. Now, are you going to say to those people that, oh, well, you have to continue suffering because some moralists out there think that you shouldn't be doing this? Those moralists are living in their little ivory tower, whereby they're in a position where they've had presumably healthy or relatively healthy access to sexual intimacy. So what I'm proposing is that I believe that nothing is ever going to be perfect, but if you have legally run, regulated sex zones, that's the best situation for everyone. Let me know your thoughts on this.